Guitar auction collectors doubted David Gilmour could justify bidding on the vintage Stratocaster, whispering, "Musicians don't understand investment value like serious collectors do." When Gilmour's bid history was revealed, the entire auction house learned why some instruments choose their masters. It was a crisp Tuesday evening in December 2023, and the venerable auction house of Sotheby's on New Bond Street was hosting one of its most anticipated events of the year: rock and roll royalty, vintage guitars from legendary collections. The main auction hall had been transformed into a cathedral of guitar worship, with carefully positioned spotlights illuminating the most significant vintage instruments to appear at auction in recent memory. Among the evening's lots was a particular 1959 Fender Stratocaster in three-tone sunburst finish that had generated extraordinary interest from collectors worldwide. The instrument had been consigned anonymously, with Sotheby's providing only the most basic provenance information. Previously owned by a professional musician, 1960s to 1970s. Exceptional original condition with minor playing wear consistent with professional use. The estimated value of £400,000 to £600,000 had attracted the attention of the most serious vintage guitar collectors in the world, many of whom had traveled to London specifically for this auction. These were not casual music fans or weekend enthusiasts. They were investment-focused collectors who treated vintage guitars as alternative assets in carefully curated portfolios worth millions of pounds. The preview viewing earlier that week had drawn an elite crowd of collectors, each representing years of expertise in vintage guitar markets and investment strategies. They spoke in the precise language of collectibles professionals, discussing market trends, authentication details, provenance documentation, and the complex factors that determined whether an instrument would appreciate or depreciate over time. Among the most vocal and confident collectors was Harrison Blackwood, a 52-year-old former investment banker who had transitioned into alternative asset management with a specialty in vintage musical instruments. Harrison's collection was valued at over £3 million, and he approached guitar collecting with the same analytical rigor he had once applied to international markets. The key to successful vintage guitar investment, Harrison often explained to fellow collectors, is understanding that these instruments are appreciating assets first and musical tools second. Emotional purchasing decisions are the enemy of sound investment strategy. Harrison's circle of collecting colleagues shared his perspective. Margaret Thornfield, a 48-year-old art dealer who had expanded into musical memorabilia, owned 17 vintage guitars that she had never played and never intended to play. "I love music," she would say, "but when you're dealing with instruments worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, sentimentality becomes a luxury you can't afford." Richard Pemberton, a 55-year-old tech entrepreneur whose guitar collection filled a climate-controlled warehouse, applied algorithmic analysis to vintage guitar markets, tracking pricing trends and identifying undervalued instruments with the precision of a quantitative hedge fund manager. "Data doesn't lie," was his motto. "Musical legends may be inspiring, but market fundamentals determine returns." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a 49-year-old museum curator who collected vintage guitars as alternative investments for her retirement portfolio, approached each acquisition with academic thoroughness, researching every detail of an instrument's history, construction, and market position before making strategic purchasing decisions. As the collectors gathered in Sotheby's elegant pre-auction reception area, their conversation focused on the evening's star lot, the 1959 Stratocaster that represented the pinnacle of Fender's golden era manufacturing. "This particular instrument," Harrison was explaining to the group, "represents everything that serious collectors look for: peak production year, exceptional original condition, and mysterious provenance that adds to its mystique. The anonymous consignment actually increases its investment appeal. Buyers are purchasing the instrument's inherent value rather than paying a celebrity premium. Margaret agreed enthusiastically. When guitars are sold based on celebrity ownership, you're essentially buying autographs rather than assets. This Stratocaster will be valued purely on its musical and historical significance, which creates more stable long-term appreciation potential. As the collectors continued their analysis, they noticed a quietly dressed older man examining the auction catalog with obvious interest. David Gilmour had registered for the auction under a private bidding number, but his understated presence meant that he blended easily into the crowd of well-dressed collectors and curious observers. Richard, who prided himself on knowing every serious collector in the vintage guitar market, didn't recognize the older gentleman and assumed he was either a casual attendee or perhaps a journalist covering the auction for a music publication. "Look at that guy," Richard whispered to his collecting colleagues. "He's been staring at the catalog description for the 59 Strat for 20 minutes. Probably a musician who's gotten caught up in the romance of owning a legendary instrument without understanding the financial realities involved." Dr. Morrison, whose academic background made her particularly attentive to behavioral details, observed Gilmour's careful attention to the instrument specifications. "He seems genuinely interested, but musicians rarely have the financial resources or investment sophistication needed to compete at this level. Instruments like this require serious capital and long-term portfolio strategy." As the auction began and the early lots generated spirited bidding, the collectors continued their quiet commentary about market dynamics and investment strategies. They were particularly dismissive of what they perceived as emotional or sentimental bidding from participants who didn't understand vintage guitars as appreciating assets. When Lot 47, the 1959 Stratocaster, was finally presented, the auction hall fell silent with anticipation. Sotheby's specialist provided the basic details: exceptional original condition, authenticated vintage specifications, and provenance tracing to professional musical use during the instrument's golden era. Bidding opened at £300,000, immediately establishing the serious nature of the competition. Harrison entered the bidding confidently, viewing the acquisition as a strategic addition to his vintage Fender portfolio. Margaret, Richard, and Dr. Morrison were also active participants, each applying their investment expertise to determine maximum rational bid limits. As the bidding escalated past £500,000, the collectors began whispering among themselves about the identity and qualifications of their competition. "Whoever's bidding against us clearly has serious capital," Margaret observed, "but I wonder if they understand the market dynamics involved in vintage guitar investment. This level of spending requires long-term appreciation strategy, not emotional attachment." Richard, who had been carefully tracking bidding patterns, noticed that the quiet older man from the preview was participating actively in the competition. "That musician guy is actually bidding," he said with surprise. "He's either completely out of his depth financially, or he doesn't understand that guitars at this price point are investment vehicles, not musical instruments." Dr. Morrison, applying her academic analytical approach to the situation, whispered her assessment. "Musicians think emotionally about instruments. They see a beautiful guitar and imagine the music they could create with it, but they rarely consider market positioning, comparable sales data, or long-term asset appreciation potential." As bidding continued past £600,000, approaching the high end of Sotheby's estimate, Harrison became increasingly confident that the unknown bidder would soon reach his financial limit. "Serious collectors understand portfolio allocation," he explained to his colleagues. "You never overextend on a single acquisition, regardless of how attractive the piece might be." But David Gilmour continued bidding with the calm persistence of someone for whom this particular instrument represented something beyond financial investment or portfolio strategy. When the bidding reached £750,000, well above the estimated range, Richard leaned toward his fellow collectors with growing concern. This is getting irrational. No vintage guitar, regardless of its quality or provenance, justifies this level of financial commitment from an investment perspective. Margaret nodded in agreement. Exactly. Musicians don't understand investment value like serious collectors do. They get caught up in romantic notions about famous instruments without considering market fundamentals or resale potential. Dr. Morrison was more direct in her assessment. Whoever's driving this bidding up doesn't have the collector mentality necessary for sound vintage guitar investment. This is exactly the kind of emotional purchasing that leads to poor returns and market instability. As the bidding approached £800,000, Harrison made the decision that he later described as the most financially prudent of his collecting career. He withdrew from the competition. "I refuse to let sentiment override strategy," he announced to his colleagues. Vintage guitar collecting requires discipline and analytical thinking. Emotional bidding is how people destroy portfolios and destabilize markets. When the auctioneer's hammer finally fell at £850,000, the collectors sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what they had just witnessed. "Some musician just paid £850,000 for a guitar," Richard said with disbelief. "That's not collecting. That's financial irresponsibility." Margaret was equally bewildered. The investment fundamentals simply don't support that price point. Whoever bought that instrument either has unlimited resources or doesn't understand basic asset management principles. Dr. Morrison applied her analytical expertise to the situation. This type of irrational bidding behavior threatens the entire vintage guitar market. When prices become disconnected from underlying value, it creates bubble conditions that harm serious collectors. What happened next would fundamentally transform each collector's understanding of the relationship between musical instruments and the people who are truly meant to own them. James Whitfield, Sotheby's senior specialist in musical instruments, approached the podium to make an unusual announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have permission from the winning bidder to share some additional information about this evening's sale that we believe you'll find illuminating." The auction hall waited in anticipation as Whitfield continued. "The 1959 Fender Stratocaster you've just seen sold was purchased by Mr. David Gilmour of Pink Floyd. What makes this acquisition particularly meaningful is that this instrument was actually Mr. Gilmour's personal guitar from 1969 to 1974, during the recording of several Pink Floyd albums, including The Dark Side of the Moon." The revelation created an immediate stir throughout the auction hall. The anonymous consignment, mysterious provenance, and lack of celebrity documentation suddenly made perfect sense. David Gilmour had been bidding to reacquire his own instrument. The guitar was sold in 1974 when Mr. Gilmour was upgrading his equipment for Pink Floyd's world tour, Whitfield explained. "It has remained in private hands for nearly 50 years. Tonight, it returns to the musician who created some of rock history's most memorable music with this particular instrument." Harrison Blackwood sat in his seat, processing the implications of what he had just learned. For 45 minutes, he had been competing against David Gilmour for a guitar that Gilmour had once owned, played professionally, and used to create music that had influenced generations of musicians. Margaret Thornfield's carefully calculated investment strategy suddenly seemed inadequate compared to the authentic emotional and historical connection that had driven Gilmour's bidding. This wasn't a musician making an irrational emotional purchase. This was an artist reclaiming an instrument that had been part of his creative identity. Richard Pemberton's algorithmic market analysis had completely missed the most important factor in determining the guitar's value: its personal significance to the musician who had made it famous. No amount of data analysis could have predicted or quantified the value of artistic reunion. Dr. Morrison's academic approach to collecting felt suddenly hollow compared to the living history that connected David Gilmour to this particular instrument. Her museum-quality understanding of provenance paled beside the reality of an artist's authentic relationship with a tool of his creative expression. As the auction concluded and the collectors gathered for the traditional post-sale reception, their conversation had changed dramatically from the confident investment analysis that had characterized the evening's beginning. "I feel like I completely missed the point," Harrison admitted to his colleagues. "I was so focused on market positioning and portfolio strategy that I never considered that some instruments have stories that transcend investment logic." Margaret was more direct in her self-assessment. David Gilmour wasn't bidding as a collector or an investor. He was bidding to reunite with an instrument that had been part of his artistic life. We were approaching this as a financial transaction, but for him, it was about restoring a broken connection. Richard, whose quantitative approach to collecting had been thoroughly challenged, reflected on the evening's lesson. "All my market analysis was irrelevant because I was missing the most important variable, the relationship between the artist and the instrument. You can't algorithm your way to understanding that kind of authentic connection." Dr. Morrison summarized what all four collectors had learned. "We thought we were experts in vintage guitar value because we understood market dynamics and investment principles. But tonight we learned that the most valuable guitars aren't necessarily the ones that appreciate most financially. They're the ones that choose their masters and return to them when the time is right." David Gilmour, who had quietly collected his reacquired 1959 Stratocaster and left the auction house without fanfare, had unknowingly provided the most expensive education in musical instrument collecting that any of them would ever receive. 6 months later, Harrison Blackwood restructured his entire approach to vintage guitar collecting, focusing less on investment potential and more on the historical and musical significance of the instruments he acquired. Margaret Thornfield began learning to play guitar, discovering that understanding an instrument's musical capabilities enhanced rather than compromised its investment value. Richard Pemberton expanded his analytical algorithms to include factors related to emotional and historical significance, finding that guitars with authentic musical provenance actually performed better as long-term investments than purely speculative acquisitions. Dr. Morrison developed a new approach to her museum work that emphasized the living relationships between artists and their instruments, rather than treating musical tools as static historical artifacts. The story of the 850,000-pound Stratocaster became legendary in vintage guitar collecting circles, not because of the price paid, but because of what it revealed about the difference between owning instruments and being chosen by them. That night taught us that the most successful vintage guitar collecting isn't about market expertise or investment strategy, Harrison reflected a year later. It's about recognizing which instruments have stories that matter and understanding that some guitars will always find their way back to the musicians who are meant to play them. The 1959 Fender Stratocaster, now restored to David Gilmour's collection, continued serving its true purpose, helping one of the world's great guitarists create music that moves and inspires people around the world. The 850,000 pounds price tag became irrelevant compared to the value of artistic reunion and the continuation of a musical partnership that had been interrupted for nearly 50 years. If this story of authentic connection triumphing over market calculation and the mysterious ways that musical instruments choose their true owners inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone who collects musical instruments or believes that some objects carry stories that transcend financial value. Have you ever witnessed a moment when emotional truth proved more valuable than expert analysis? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the unexpected ways that music, memory, and meaning intersect in the world of vintage instrument collecting.